as I mentioned earlier, my name is Dr. Sheila McGinn. I'm chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here, so we're delighted to have you all. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the three panelists for this session. I will do them in sequence like was done before. So our first panelist is Professor Osman Kobo, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University. Professor Kobo received his Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from the City College of New York in 1992, his Master of Arts in International Relations, also from the City College of New York, in 1995, and his PhD in History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2005. Before joining the History Department at Ohio State in 2006, Professor Kobo served as a visiting assistant professor of African history at Marquette University, a sister school in Milwaukee, and Gettysburg College. Professor Kobo's research and teaching interests include 20th century West African social and religious history, contemporary Islamic history, Sufism, Islam under French and British colonialism in Africa, and the social history of West African migrants in the United States. His book, Unveiling Modernity in West African Islamic Reforms, 1950 to 2000, was published by Brill in 2012. And the book documents and compares the histories of contemporary Islamic reforms associated with Wahhabism in Ghana and Burkina Faso. The book also examines the ways in which the rise of Wahhabi-inclined movements at the end of colonial rule help us understand Muslims' engagements with modernity. His other publications include the development of Wahhabi reforms in Ghana and Burkina Faso, 1960 to 1990, elective affinities between Western-educated Muslims and Islamic scholars, which was published in Comparative Studies in Society and History in 2009, and We Are Citizens Too, The Politics of Citizenship in Independent Ghana, which came out from the Journal of Modern African Studies in 2010. Professor Kobo has received prestigious awards and grants to support his scholarly work, including the MacArthur Fellowship for International Peace and the Boren Fellowship. He was also co-recipient of the Distinguished Service Award awarded to two City University New York alumni during the college's centennial celebration in 1997 for his service to the college. During the 2012 to 2013 academic year, he was appointed a visiting scholar at the Center for Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford in the UK. He's currently working on his second book manuscript, tentatively titled The Gun and the Rosary, Subtle Relations of Coexistence Between Charismatic Muslim Leaders and French Colonial Administration in Burkina Faso, 1920 to 1946. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kobo.
Good morning. I would like to thank Professor Seri Toprak and the organizers of this conference, and to the audience, I say thank you for coming. I would like to make a humble contribution to the conference by using the history of a pious Sufi leader to provide some evidence of how spiritual jihad led to the expansion of Islam in West Africa, a region known in Arabic historiography as Bilad al-Sudan. When I was preparing to come to the conference, I almost changed my mind to present to you the trajectory of the development of Sufi leaders who adopted either the violent jihad or the peaceful jihad. That's what I normally do with my students in the history of Islam in Africa that I teach. I use that to whet their appetite. I use that to set the stage for them to start thinking broadly and creatively, and indeed critically, about the nature of Sufi, the nature of peaceful and non-peaceful jihad, which are pervasive in the history of Islam in Africa. The issue regarding how Islam spread in West Africa has engaged the attention of scholars since the 19th century. Majority of historians agree that Islam spread in Africa south of the Sahara gradually through the activities of itinerant scholars and preachers, as well as traders. Prior to the dawn of European colonialism, starting from the late 1800s, Muslim preachers and merchants associated with Sufi brotherhoods propagated Islam in subtle ways throughout the sub-region. While historians agree that while scholars agree that the intermittent infusion of jihad into the process of Islamization had no significant effect on the spread of the faith in Bilad al-Sudan, these scholars are still struggling to explain why Islam spread much faster in the region during the colonial period than in the previous several centuries. Islam had been in West Africa since the 8th century, by the way, almost the same time that Islam reached the Andalusia. The difficulties rested on the wrong assumption that European colonizers supported Christian missionaries to spread the Christian faith, but failed to achieve the desired objective. The reality was that the fear of Muslim rebellions inhibited many colonial administrators from directly encouraging Christian missionaries to proselytize in territories considered Islamic. This conclusion led many historians to look elsewhere for the evidence, and this led to the recognition of the agency of charismatic Muslim clerics. But here too, many historians and anthropologists of Islam divided Muslim scholars between those who cooperated with colonial rulers in exchange for the freedom to gather followers and to propagate their ideas on the one hand, and those who continued to resist colonial rule. Those who failed to submit to colonial rule, the resistors, quote unquote, were often suppressed by the colonial rulers. From this perspective, Muslim loyalists of European colonialism made strategic decisions that allowed them to spread Islam under the watchful eyes of colonial administrators. There is some evidence to support this position, and I don't have enough time to give you those evidence. However, there are other Muslim preachers who succeeded remarkably in their religious missions without the support or patronage of colonial administrators. This position has gained traction among historians of Islam in Africa, thus allowing us to pay close attention to how the emphasis on peaceful coexistence and attention to inner spirituality remained the conduit for Islamization even during the colonial period and indeed in our present times. And for this reason, I will say yes to the question mark at the end of the title of this conference. This paper looks at a lesser-known process of Islamization during the colonial period that fit neither in the collaboration nor the resistance theories. This is the history of the pious ascetic Boubacar Sawadgo of Upper Volta. Both oral history and colonial records credit this leader for spreading Islam in the French colony of Upper Volta, which is Burkina Faso today, a colony that had barely been touched by Islam prior to the colonial period. Let me show you, this is the map of Bilad al-Sudan. Okay, now. This is the map of West Africa. One could see Burkina Faso on top of northern Ghana. The paper highlights how Boubacar Sawadgo developed a new approach toward conversion that emphasized coexistence with French administrations without officially declaring loyalty to the colonial regime. This approach allowed him to convert a large number of people to Islam despite the apprehension of French colonial administrators regarding Islamic proselytism, which they described as the Muslim fanaticism. It is quite uncomfortable to be talking about French Islam on a day like this, but we have to deal with it, I guess. This scholar argued that violent jihad is an aberration in Islam that often interfered with personal spiritual growth. He therefore emphasized the individual and collective spiritual transformation through the litanies of the Tijaniya Sufi Brotherhood. The Tijaniya order, founded by Ahmad Tijani in the late 1700s in Algeria and Morocco, spread to West Africa during the early 1800s. To foster spiritual transformation rooted in the Tijaniya brotherhood, Boubacar Sawadgo did not only preach and teach, but also created a conducive atmosphere and attitudes among his followers that attracted new converts. As a result of this approach, the Muslim population of the colony grew from a mere 12% in 1900, as the French recorded it, to 35% in the 1940s. These were derived from French records. By the time of independence in 1960, the Muslim population had reached 45%. Today, Burkina Faso is considered a Muslim-majority nation, and in 1996, even hosted a summit of the Organization of Islamic Conferences. Let me just show you a map. It's a map of members of the Islamic conferences. Interestingly, Sawadgo was successful despite French repression and the intense competition between him and the White Fathers Mission for new converts. Always nervous about the possibility of Muslim rebellion, the French developed a plan to prevent the spread of Islam in territories they considered to be non-Islamized at the time of the conquest. Burkina Faso was identified as one of those territories. Located south of the Islamized territories of Mali, and the north of the non-Islamized colonies of Ivory Coast, Togo, and Benin, the French saw Burkina Faso as a possible zone that separates Muslim and non-Muslim colonies. Let's just go back to these maps, and these are the places I'm referring to. Mali, by the way, is widely known as one of the major centers of Islam, and indeed, before the colonial period, it was. Now, Burkina Faso was not. Burkina Faso was therefore to be quarantined lest it became a corridor for the diffusion of the faith to other less Islamized colonies. The French plan was aided by the fact that the largest ethnic group in Burkina Faso, the Nursi state, had resisted Islam for more than 5 centuries before the advent of European rule, despite their proximity to dominant Muslim empires. Maybe I can show you this in another map. You can see the Nursis below well-established Muslim states. You have the Songhai and the Mali, and the Nursis were right to the south, but refused to embrace Islam. As part of the process of quarantining this territory to remain un-Islamic, the French allowed the White Fathers missionaries to establish their first mission in West Africa in this colony in 1901, the year Nursi society succumbed to French conquest. For the French, it was better for Nursi to embrace Catholicism than to fall to Islam. From Burkina Faso, the White Fathers mission spread into neighboring territories, including the Anglophone colony of the Gold Coast, today Ghana. Sawadgo reversed the French expectations through peaceful means. Exploring his history will therefore broaden our understanding of the impact of Jihad al-Kabir as the main instrument responsible for the Islamization of most of the West African sub-region. Boubacar Sawadgo was born a non-Muslim around 1883 and began his religious career in 1920 after more than a decade of religious training in Mali first, Sudan, and then in Saudi Arabia in the Haramain. He converted to Islam between 1900 and 1902 through a Hausa merchant who resided in his household and needed a boy to serve as his errand boy. Boubacar was selected to serve him. Boubacar admired this merchant and the way he practiced his faith, which was unknown in the region, and pleaded with the merchant to convert him. The merchant agreed, but asked Boubacar to promise to keep this secret, and they did. After his conversion, Boubacar left, as was advised by this merchant, to go to Mali and study Islam and to return and propagate the faith to his community. Boubacar left, studied in Mali, went to Fez, and I believe that's where he first embraced Tijaniya, and then from there he decided to go and perform the pilgrimage. As was done during that period, most West African pilgrims, they performed the pilgrimage by foot, traveling for 2 years or more. They usually would arrive in Sudan. It was the first place of rest and acquiring resources. Here he worked, he settled at Al-Fashir in today, of course, Darfur region of Sudan. Here he encountered a very prominent scholar by the name of Sheikh Salman. He worked with this scholar, but at the end of the month, when the scholar went to pay him, he said, "No, I don't want money." He said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want your blessing, I want your barakah, because my intention is to return to my society to convert them to Islam." After making all kinds of efforts to convince Boubacar to accept his wages, Sheikh Salman finally agreed. And he called his new disciple, holding a tasbih in his hand, and he said to him, and I quote, "Go and wage a jihad, but your jihad is a peaceful jihad. Call your people to true Islam with la ilaha illallah, and they will respond in ways they never responded to any preacher before you. This rosary is your weapon. Use it in all circumstances. Avoid aggression, because aggressors are not among Allah's friends. To be among Allah's friends, you must avoid shedding the blood of fellow humans, protect all of Allah's creations, including plants and weaker animals, and restrain yourself against aggression, and Allah will protect you against your enemies." The Sheikh left with this instruction, arrived in the colony in 1920. The French spies immediately picked him up. He was detained and questioned. All the books that he had carried with him were seized from him, as the French had always did, and he was released to go back to his people. He arrived in his village, Namiskma, and started preaching Islam. The elders said, "What have you brought to us?" He said, "I have brought the true religion." His village, Namiskma, by the way, was known for its very, very strong fetish belief system. It was indeed the very place that most of the rulers would go to acquire spiritual power. So this man has now arrived to challenge that spiritual power and indeed the dominance of the society. His folks said, "Well, we don't want this here. If you want to preach, you have to get out of here. Oh, by the way, we can give you a territory which is not too far from here, and that territory is infested with jinns and all kinds of evil spirits. You can go and settle there. If you're able to get rid of the jinns, you can thank your God. Otherwise, they will destroy you." He agreed, moved to this particular area, built his community, which he named Rahmatullah. Now, I want to just very quickly show you a picture of Rahmatullah. This is Rahmatullah today. And the Maulud, the picture to your right, is the gathering of the Maulud. Boubacar became very, very popular within a very short period of time. And of course, as we would expect, this alarmed the French. In 1921, there was a conflict among Muslims in Nyoro, northern part of Mali, which was believed to implicate a particular sharif by the name of Sheikh Hamaullah. Before Sheikh Boubacar left his mentor, Sheikh Salma, he instructed Boubacar, there will arise a stronger, higher spiritual leader who is a sharif somewhere in Mali or Niger. When you hear about this sharif, go to him and renew your Tijani litany. Indeed, Boubacar discovered this man, went to Nyoro and embraced this man, and of course this scholar, who by the way was eventually exiled in France, and he died in France. And buried in France. I had the opportunity of visiting his grave in Monsignor in France. Boubacar's alliance with this particular leader antagonized his relationship with the French, who had already marked this leader down as the most notorious fanatic. Even though this leader had submitted to the French, he agreed with the French, he recognized their dominance, he accepted their rule, but he and his enemies among the Tijanis antagonized his relationship with the French, and the French marked him down for repression. He was arrested and exiled in Côte d'Ivoire. When he returned, they sent him to Algeria. They kept exiling him back and forth until finally he fell sick in Paris, and he died, and then they buried him in a cemetery that is, most of the people in that cemetery were World War II soldiers. Now let's go back to Sheikh Boubacar. Boubacar, after returning, the French told him, you went and met this man, you are a very dangerous person. But he told him, he said, we are very peaceful people, we've been pursuing peaceful propagation of Islam, and I have no intention whatsoever to obstruct French rule. But he refused. When the French asked him, he refused to swear allegiance of loyalty to the French. Nonetheless, the French actually, according to the many, many records in the archives, recognized him as peaceful. I will give you one quotation. In 1936 report, this is what we read. The teachings of the Marabout of Nemisma, which is Abu Bakr, is spreading far and wide. His doctrine prohibits his followers from having social relations with people who use tobacco. That is the fetishists. They must neither shake their hands nor greet them, let alone participate in their funeral rites. His teachings have resulted in serious dispute among Mursi and appears to fragment families. Another one in 1941 says, Rakimia, which was his old name before he converted, shows his hostility to other Muslims who were not part of his sect, as well as the Mursi fetish chiefs. He prohibited his followers from having contact with other Mursi and not to even participate in the funeral rites of their non-Muslim parents. In the villages, his followers separated themselves from other Muslims while they engaged in a tacit struggle against those who practice ancestral religion to which Mursi are profoundly attached. But his Islam is authentic, and he is a very smart person. This relationship continued, and the French never bothered this man, despite his bad relationship with the local leaders. I don't have enough time to give you some other references. But in 1941, as a result of a small conflict in the colony and the Vichy regime's apprehension of Muslim fanaticism, decided that all members of the Hamawiyya were those who followed Sheikh Hamawullah. The followers of Sheikh Hamawullah were arrested, including Boubacar Sawadgo, who had committed no offense, and they were incarcerated. Boubacar spent 5 years in very harsh conditions in Mali until he was at the end of the Second World War. He was released in 1946, and he died immediately after. So let me use my remaining, can I take 2 extra minutes, to draw a conclusion. The history of Sheikh Boubacar Sawadgo adds a crucial layer to our knowledge of the central role of Jihad al-Kabir as the main conduit for the spread of Islam in West Africa, especially during the colonial period. His history offers a new perspective that emphasizes the role of charisma, knowledge, and strategies of cohabitation developed by Sufi leaders who had rejected violent jihad and religious confrontations in expanding the Muslim frontiers. It is illustrated here that without any direct negotiation, Boubacar Sawadgo and French administrators independently adopted strategies of coexistence that simultaneously facilitated colonial stability and the growth of Islam. By the way, Boubacar Sawadgo paid his taxes. He encouraged his people to pay their taxes. In fact, he did something that was marvelous, which I have to share with you. Whenever anybody brought him a gift, on his mat, he had a place on the left. He would ask the person, where did you get this money? Is it from your sweat? If the person is unable to answer correctly, to demonstrate that the gift, the hadaya, came from his sweat, he would put it on the left. If the person demonstrates, he would put it to the right. The one to the left, he used to give, to reward French soldiers or French gendarmes who passes through the town. And he told his people, these people can eat dirt. We eat what is only clean. The one to the right, it's what belongs to us. The one to the left belongs to those who don't care about their spiritual development. Thank you very much for your attention. I will stop here.
Thank you, Professor. Our next speaker is Professor Irfan Omar. Professor Omar is Associate Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He is interested in the intersections and connections between Islam and other religions. Professor Omar has edited or co-edited several volumes, including Peacemaking and the Challenge of Violence in World Religions, which appeared in 2015, The Judeo-Christian Islamic Heritage, Philosophical and Theological Perspectives, which appeared in 2012, and A Christian View of Islam, Essays on Dialogue by Thomas F. Michel, Society of Jesus, which appeared in 2010. He currently serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. From 2010 to 2014, he served on the steering committee of the ethics section of the American Academy of Religion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Omar.
Good morning. Peace be upon you all, today, tomorrow, and for the rest of your lives, in case I don't see you. So the topic that I have for today is Ijtihad as intellectual jihad, renewal of the spirit of Islam in Maulana Wahiduddin Khan's thought. In case some of us may not know who Wahiduddin Khan is, he just turned 90 this year, and he is still writing by way of dictation and giving talks internationally and nationally. He lives in New Delhi, India. He was in Chicago last summer to attend the Islamic Society of North America's annual convention, where he was given Lifetime Achievement Award. Even though my paper is on ijtihad, let me just say a couple of things about jihad itself, because Wahiduddin Khan has very distinct views about this notion. So in his books, he has several books that deal with this aspect of jihad. He's been writing for the last 40 years, mostly in Urdu and Arabic. Lately, many of his books have also appeared in English. For him, there is no such thing as peaceful jihad, because jihad essentially means peaceful activity. He has gone to great lengths to talk about how he interprets the Quranic understanding of jihad and distinguishes it from the notion of qital. He has invoked the dictionary meaning often to speak about this term like other terms in his writings, and he cites several examples from Arabic literature which use the words that come out of the same root letters that jihad comes out of, jahada. So one example will suffice here, how some people in Arab culture use the word jahad al-laban, trying to extract butter with your utmost effort. And so it's a very utilitarian meaning. To summarize, essentially what he's saying is that the Quranic jihad has the same thrust to invoke the reader to not value comforts of life and possessions over the responsibility to do dawah. And so that's where his focus is, which he regards as greater jihad. So in a summary version, what he's doing is he's resisting the transformation of the term jihad from an attitude to a set of activities, as an attitude to activities. Now, Professor McGinn mentioned the book that I just co-edited. In it, I have a chapter on jihad and nonviolence in the Islamic tradition. So one section that deals with jihad, I wanted to just read that passage because reading Wahiduddin Khan set me on a different path. I looked at other sources apart from tafsir to find some kind of a reinforcement or some sense of corroboration. The word jihad itself comes from the Arabic root letters jahada, meaning to strive or to exert oneself in the religious sense, in the service of God. Incidentally, this is also the meaning apparent in the Arabic Bible, published in 1906, the version I have in my office, to refer to some of the actions of Jesus and St. Paul. In 2 Timothy chapter 4:7, RSV version, it states, quote, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept this faith." The Arabic translation of the Bible, with my version is called Al-Kitab al-Muqaddas, 1906, uses jihad and jahadto as equivalent to the English fought the good fight, which is identical to the usage of jihad in the Quran. Another instance where jihad appears in the Bible is in Luke chapter 22, verse 44. The first phrase of which states, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly," unquote, where being in agony is translated as being in the state of jihad. وَإِذْ كَانَ فِي جِهَادٍ. Once again, the term jihad is used to signify struggle and suffering in the path of righteousness, which is the same as in the service of God. Let me move now to the topic at hand, which is ijtihad. So I'm trying to examine Wahiduddin Khan's understanding of the notion of ijtihad and its application in contemporary Muslim discourse. Ijtihad is said to be one of the applications of jihad. In this sense, both jihad and ijtihad are central to Wahiduddin Khan's theology and are two important pillars in his Al-Risala movement. Khan sees himself playing an important, even exceptional role in what he refers to as the reapplication of the principles of Islam by providing a new framework for the task of ijtihad in the present age. I say that he is playing an exceptional role because from many of his writings and speeches, one gets the impression that Maulana Khan self-identifies as one of the very few scholars engaged in this task. He claims to be what may be called a prophetic voice by raising the alarm and calling attention to the imperative of ijtihad. In his view, a vast majority of the ulama today have chosen to occupy themselves with something other than this important responsibility for which they, the ulama, should be criticized. If Khan believes ijtihad to be one of the central tasks for Muslims today, he regards jihad as the underlying spirit necessary to perform that task. The main aim of Khan's Al-Risala movement, which started in 1967, the main aim of his movement is dawah, or inviting others to learn about and or consider Islam as a religion of peace and as the repository of God's final dispensation before the end times. However, that aim has been lost due to erroneous interpretation of Islam over many centuries. Khan believes that interpretation and elucidation of the message of the Quran is a corrective. His interpretation and elucidation of the message of the Quran is a corrective to the dominant reading and understanding prevalent among Muslims today. This corrective is vital and needs to be disseminated with some urgency. Thus, all of Khan's writings are promoted as a kind of a new discourse, an intellectual presentation of Islam based on the spirit of the Quran. This he views as the work of ijtihad, carried out with a striving of a lifetime. This is his personal jihad. He wrote some years ago that there are those today who object to ijtihad by arguing that this activity is not sanctioned by the tradition. They argue that the gates of ijtihad were closed for a good reason and they should remain closed. In contrast, Khan finds such arguments to be hollow, saying that the so-called gates of ijtihad were never closed despite claims made by some religious authorities in previous centuries, as well as echoes of these found today. While it is true that there were fatwas given by a few scholars against ijtihad in as early as the 10th century, many major Muslim scholars throughout history have asserted their right to engage in ijtihad and have produced significant works on the subject. He gives examples of Ash-Shatibi, Ibn Khaldun, As-Suyuti, Shawkani, Maraghi, and in India, Ashraf Ali Thanvi. He says that all of these scholars and many more have in fact, both in and through their writings, shown that ijtihad is a perpetual task and an ongoing responsibility of the ulama. Ijtihad, by its very definition, implies unceasing activity, reformulating the message of Islam in every age. Thus, the obligation of a mujtahid is to discover new ways in which to apply the teachings of Islam in the ever-changing circumstances in which Muslims inevitably find themselves. This is achieved by reinterpreting the core principles of Islam without violating their spirit. In his own words, mujtahid ka kaam hai badle hue halat mein Islam ki asar-e-no tashrih karna, interpretation. At the same time, Khan is quite clear on what ijtihad is not. He states, ijtihad does not mean seeking to change the core principles of Islam. It does not mean to reconstitute Islam itself. Islam par nazar-e-sani karna koi ijtihad nahi hai. Ijtihad is also not synonymous with reform or islah, which is much more intrusive and unnecessary. Ijtihad is carried out as a result of the changing circumstances which call for adapting to new ways of being and living within the parameters of the spirit of the law of Islam. This he identifies as tatbiq, inasmuch as attempts to close the gates of ijtihad in previous centuries were aimed at curtailing the activities of some scholars who, in his words, transgressed the rules of ijtihad itself. Such a move may be understandable. The declaration and aims to ban ijtihad on the part of some ulama may be explained as a response to the apparent undermining of religiously mandated practices, such as the Arkan, 5 daily prayers, by some mystical and political groups of the time. In turn, these groups had introduced alternate practices that were considered bid'ah by the orthodoxy. Examples of this would include the introduction of new forms of worship not inherited from the Prophet himself, and mandating these as integral to Islamic spiritual practices. Such innovation, in his view, had to be opposed because this amounted to engaging and promoting in extra-Islamic practices. Such restrictions were placed by past scholars not to ban ijtihad itself, but rather to prevent activities that were erroneously dubbed as ijtihad. So in its Quranic and prophetic sense, ijtihad implies engaging in a discussion with oneself, others, and one's sources. And that means these three change all the time in every age. It is to arrive at yet unknown solution to a problem based on the information which is already known. It is a dialectical investigation of the truth in order to determine the best course of action in a given situation. Ijtihad is not to change Islam, but to adapt it to the demands of each age. I'm going to skip some of this stuff here. His criticism of the ulama is that they are not only opposed to Islam, but they are unaware of the changes that have taken place. So he gives two reasons of why ulama are opposed to ijtihad and continue to operate under, with the pretext of preserving law and tradition. So the first reason is that this inherited and somewhat dated knowledge that ulama have is the only knowledge ulama of today are familiar with. They are oblivious to the progress in science and learning that is being made in every day. The second reason is to undertake ijtihad necessitates taking a critical view of the past as well as of tradition. The ulama of today have decided to frown upon this activity. They believe that since it involves tanqeed, criticism, of famous scholars, past and present, it is a derisive thing to do. Many senior ulama are also not interested in upsetting their comfort zone by criticizing established norms. The anti-taqlid ulama are essentially failing in their duty to carry out the jihad of the pen. In contrast, those few who are calling for ijtihad are the true mujahids. They are striving in order to move beyond and away from the taqlidi, blind following of the past, attitude prevalent among Muslims for several centuries. The theological stillness or meekness by way of taqlid has caused Muslim societies to become stagnant. Ijtihad can deliver them from this state of being. However, ijtihad inevitably requires tanqeed, which is the antithesis of taqlid. Taking a critical perspective would imply that we read the work of our past scholars, however esteemed they may be, with a fresh eye. We ought to unpack their interpretations, their reasoning, their deductions for Islamic living in a systematic fashion. We would apply the same methods of ijtihad that they did in their work. However, we would apply these in light of our current knowledge and our context. That is what we know today about the world, about scientific approach to life, about human relationships, social and cultural aspects of life, and so on. Without appropriating critical methods, ijtihad is not possible. Many scholars of today are either ignorant of or have some aversion to criticism. They argue that criticism of our intellectual forebears is akin to blasphemy. Even though Khan is pro-criticism, he goes to great lengths to note that tanqeed is a purely intellectual exercise, and it involves ideas and interpretations, methodology and context. Tanqeed should not be confused with tanqis, or character assassination, a practice not too uncommon among pseudo-scholars past and present. In the present time, stagnant attitudes in Islamic discourse have caused Muslims to feel alienated from the age of which they are a part. The numerous issues that arise within the present context need to be discussed, debated, and commented upon by the ulama so as to provide Islamically acceptable responses to them. The silence, or worse, ignorance of the issues by ulama has been astounding, and as a result, we are experiencing a huge rift between the ulama and large segments of the population in many Muslim societies. The gap between the religious and secular dimensions, between popular culture and norms of Islamic propriety, has grown so considerably wide in the modern period. As a result, many Muslims today live two separate lives, and often opposing lives, one that pulls them toward their religious roots, and the other which pertains to their national, cultural, and increasingly global identities. The latter is also the domain of popular culture in which Muslims live, breathe, earn their livelihood, and connect with others as social beings. Naturally, in the tension between these two, the aspect that is often neglected is one's religious and spiritual heritage, because it seems dispensable. It is also often at odds with the primary, quote, color and taste of life in the 21st century. Khan argues that it is imperative that these two selves be harmonized if Islam's heritage is to be passed on and for the sake of Muslims' spiritual development. The rift between religious and secular selves is now perilously wide due to the fast pace of change, we experience today and the utter lack of meaningful response by the ulama. I better hurry. To renew the spirit of Islam, which by Quran's own account should be attempted in every age, Muslims have to engage in ijtihad on a host of issues involving human rights and Islamic ethical norms. The issues are numerous, and if not addressed in a methodical and systematic fashion, they will continue to damage the image of Islam. He has spoken often about this. He's very concerned about the image of Islam because of terrorist violence that is perpetrated by many Muslims. This is what Khan is most concerned about because in his view, Prophet Muhammad gave this responsibility to his followers to carry on the message of Islam and to live by the ethical dictates of the Quran so as to fulfill the Quranic mandate of inviting others to the path of peace and justice, and to compete, quoting the Quran 364, compete with other communities in doing good. By not engaging in ijtihad, Muslims are failing to discharge their duties given them by the Prophet. Inasmuch as ijtihad involves a major effort on the part of the ulama to familiarize themselves with the current state of knowledge in all the various aspects of contemporary life, it is indeed a jihad of a sort, an intellectual jihad, if you will. Such a jihad today would involve a completely different approach than any previously adopted by the ulama. For example, this intellectual jihad has to be disassociated with political ideologies of our day. It has to be focused on simply presenting Islam in the idiom which is understandable to people of all backgrounds and nations. This approach, according to Khan, will help renew the spirit of Islam among Muslims because it represents moving away from the mere literal understanding of the message. One more minute. I don't have an excuse because I can see that clock. Khan is also aware that such efforts in ijtihad can tarnish one's reputation and make one a pariah in one's own community. He expressed this idea in a form of a popular saying, "Aghyar ki mukhalifat aadmi ko hero banati hai, aur apno ki mukhalifat aadmi ko zero banati hai." Yani, criticism of others causes one to become a hero, and criticism of one's own community makes one a zero. Let me go to conclusion. The choice for Muslims today is not between taqleed and ijtihad. Rather, the choice is between doing ijtihad or becoming obsolete. The failure to live up to the message of Islam will surely bring infamy in this world and accountability in the next. As followers of Muhammad and bearers of his mission, Muslims are given the charge of informing all humanity of the, quote, pristine message of Islam. As ambassadors of peace, this is how his followers are known. As ambassadors of peace and spirituality of Islam, Muslims have no choice but to take up the intellectual jihad, now long overdue, in order to fulfill their obligation to God and to other human beings. Otherwise, the community will fail to live up to its challenge. I should end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Omar. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Zeki Saratoprak, who will be our final panelist this morning. Zeki Bey is a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Bediüzzamin Said Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies at John Carroll University. He holds a PhD in Islamic theology from the University of Marmara in Turkey. His dissertation, which examined the personification of evil in the Islamic tradition, is entitled The Antichrist, Al-Dajjal, in Islamic Theology, and was published in Turkish in Istanbul in 1992. Prior to coming to John Carroll, Professor Saratoprak held positions at Harran University in Turkey, Georgetown University, the Catholic University of America, and Berry College in Rome, Georgia. He's also the founder and former president of the Rumi Forum for Interfaith Dialogue, which is based in Washington, D.C. Professor Sarah is the author of over 30 academic articles and encyclopedia entries on topics related to Islam. He has served as guest editor for issues of the journals Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations and the Muslim World. He is editor and co-translator of Fundamentals of Rumi's Thought, a Mevlevi Sufi Perspective, which was published by The Light in English in 2004, and the editor of a critical edition of al-Saraksi's Sifat Ashrat al-Sa'ah, I hope I said that right, which was published in Cairo in 1993. His most recent book, Islam's Jesus, was published by the University Press of Florida in 2014, and he's currently preparing a book on Islamic spirituality, tentatively titled Islamic Spirituality, Theology, and Practice for the Modern World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zeki Saratopoulos.
Good afternoon. It's afternoon now, I think. So in 20 minutes, I will, that's great. That's a very good way of following our time period. Now, my talk is actually about Nursi's last message. The title is Spiritual Jihad as a Model to be Followed by Muslims, reading Nursi's last message. So I know that it is important to know a little bit about Nursi as a kind of background for this presentation. But because for the interest of time, I will not elaborate on that dimension. I will refer you to our website, Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies, and we have plenty of knowledge about Nursi and actually his biography, as I think as a PDF also. So since the beginning of Islam, the term jihad has been used and understood in a variety of ways. While the word jihad is mentioned only in 3 places in the Quran, in chapter 9:24, chapter 25:52, and chapter 61, and chapter 22:78. There are at least 38 instances of related words being used in the Quran. In the Islamic tradition, jihad has been understood as a physical action to right a wrong or to end oppression, is a general understanding. It's also well known that jihad is understood by Muslims as a struggle against personal weaknesses, inclinations, desires, or what is called evil commanding soul. And I think my colleagues elaborated on this very well. The Prophet used to call this greater jihad. It is also well known that jihad is understood by Muslims as a saying the truth with words, without violence, which is described in the Quran as the greater jihad as well, jihad and kabira. The Quranic verse says, make jihad, the greater jihad, with the Quran. So the Quran is a means for jihad, the words of the Quran. In the early 20th century, the prominent Islamic scholar Bediüzzaman Said Nursi brought a renewed understanding of jihad. Having seen the catastrophes of the 2 world wars, I argue that he came to the conclusion that in our time, there is no space for physical jihad. It's very interesting. I think his approach is new with regard to his personal experience. Because of the possible humanitarian catastrophes which could cost the lives of millions of innocent people. So he renewed the Islamic understanding of jihad, saying that our time is the era of civilization. And for civilized people, there is no way to use the sword. Instead, one has to use the word. Therefore, Nursi suggests that the exchange of ideas should be with words and not swords. And that's why actually he names his major work as the words only. Humanity has reached the level of civilization, and therefore, this is a quote from Nursi, the diamond swords of the Quran, a term he uses, should be used rather than physical swords. With this in mind, in the following, I will elaborate on Nursi's last message to his students, which is known as his farewell letter. In his last letter that Nursi dictated to his students, perhaps few months before his death, he clearly states that this is the time of spiritual jihad and that there is no longer any space for physical jihad. In many of his letters, including this one, he frequently refers to the Quranic verse which says, "No one is carrying the burden of another. وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى." It's very significant. It seems like Nursi builds all his philosophy on this verse. No one carrying the burdens of another. And violence will always transgress this principle. Nursi often refers to this verse saying that in our time, people often kill or harm many innocents while targeting one criminal. Even early commentators suggested that this verse states that people should not be held accountable for the actions of their family, clan, tribe, etc. For example, if someone's father is criminal, children cannot be punished because of the crimes of their father. And a wife cannot be punished because of the crime of her husband. While this type of behavior was part of the era of ignorance, which is prior to Islam, pre-Islamic era, and rejected by the Quran, Nursi complains about the widespread practices of our time which go against this Quranic teaching. Nursi clearly states that there is virtually no justification for physical jihad in our time, to the extent that Nursi considers revenge as an unjust practice. He calls it an oppressive rule. Even if one has the right to defend himself or herself and do what has been done to them, according to the Quran, it is better to be patient and forgive. This is in chapter 16, verse 126. For Nursi, in our time, forgiveness has become necessary. His last letter is an important document written by his students while giving them his instructions. If it is analyzed carefully, one can find remarkable guidelines with regards to spiritual jihad. In the beginning of his letter, Nursi addresses his students as his brothers. He says, "Our duty is positive action and not negative ones. And that is to serve faith only according to what God is pleased with. Intervening in what God has planned is not our duty. We are obliged to endure any suffering that we face while serving faith positively, which ultimately produces order in society." And I think Dr. Alan Godless explained this for us at the beginning of his presentation. He speaks of 2 points. The first point is serving the faith of people, which means helping people to strengthen their faith. The second is not forcing anybody to accept certain ideas or traditions. According to Nursi, people's acceptance is part of the divine plan. Addressing his students, he says, "Your job is to convey the word, but not to make people accept it. If God wants, people will accept the message, even if you don't want. If not, they will not accept." With regard to spiritual jihad, Nursi mentions 3 important aspects of his own practice. And I will Perhaps I will have no time to elaborate on all of them, but I will mention only one. One is the practice of patience. He was patient when the government imprisoned him. And he was patient when he was forced into exile. He never accepted violence. And he was unjustly actually imprisoned and unjustly sent to exile. But despite that, he was patient. According to Nursi, what makes people react in an unjust way against each other is the lack of patience. Therefore, maintaining patience becomes necessary. Thus, we see that patience was the major theme of his spiritual jihad. At one point, he discusses his own natural reaction to oppression by saying, "Despite my nature of anti-oppression, for 40 years, I have adopted a new method of positive action, musbat hareket." Nursi gives paramount importance to this method as a new way of approaching a struggle against atrocities and oppression. It is not complacency. Instead, it is action in a positive way. For the sake of his methodology, Nursi says, "I have responded to all negativities, atrocities, and unlawful activities against myself with patience and resignation." He gives examples from pre-Islamic and Islamic history about how righteous people had suffered and gives them as a model of patience and resignation. Nursi's understanding of rida, or resignation, comes from the Sufi tradition of Islam, in which rida has an important place. It has a connotation of showing no hatred or rebellion against misfortune and accepting the things that happen as a manifestation of the divine destiny. Rida also has connotation of being pleased with God's decision. It is loving and showing respect to God, turning to God in worship and asking for help, and welcoming God's decrees. When Nursi was responding to atrocities with rida, he was referring to his mystical principle that is also considered a form of spiritual jihad. Nursi gives an example from his personal life which shows his concern and compassion for the relatives of the people who were persecuting him. And I think this is a very interesting example. There was a famous prosecutor who had prepared terrible accusations against Nursi. This was happening in a very ultra-secularist country at that time in Turkey. In a time, the Quran even was prohibited. The Holy Book was prohibited to be read in its original language. So at this time, there was a prosecutor who accusing Nursi with a variety of accusations. Nursi thought of an imprecatory prayer against the prosecutor. From his prison window, he sees a little girl playing outside in the courtyard. He asks, "Whose daughter is this girl?" He is told that this is the daughter of the prosecutor who wants to hang you. Nursi abandons his plans for his prayer as he reasons that who will take care of this girl if my prayer is answered by God? So he abandons his prayer against him, thinking of this girl, this little girl that will be raised with no father. For the sake of the girl, he gave up this impulse. Therefore, in Nursi's understanding, even an innocent action, such as asking something from God through an imprecatory prayer, can cause harm to the life of an innocent person. And even that is not allowed in Nursi's understanding. We understand from the behavior of Nursi that showing compassion to the innocents and compromising your own feelings is a spiritual jihad. In his letter, Nursi gives interesting introductory information which gives us some clues about his temper and his willfulness. He describes his reaction to certain prominent leaders. He speaks of these leaders as the head of a prominent tribe in eastern Anatolia, the founder of Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal, and the chief staff of Russian army. To all of this, Nursi spoke very powerfully in his early life. But he said, I abandoned this style, and now I have a new methodology. And that is, he calls it spiritual jihad. Why spiritual jihad? It seems that Nursi himself responds to this question by saying, because, quote from Nursi, because the destruction that human beings face today is essentially spiritual. Through spiritual jihad, we will build walls against waves of spiritual destruction. And actually, in his understanding, all these negative actions initially comes from the spiritual destruction. Because they are spiritually destroyed, they do violence. And that's why we have to go to the root of the problem. Moreover, Nursi says, with all our power, through spiritual jihad, we will help with the public order in the country. And this concept of public order is frequently repeated by Nursi, as if there is nothing more important than this, public order. Because when there is no public order, innocents' rights are missed, are transgressed. So he says, you have to be patient, even if there are atrocities, because any reaction, any negative reaction, will cause the destruction of public order. Okay, let me skip some of this. Nursi believes that his job is to serve the faith of people, of what he calls service of faith, or hizmeti imaniye, khidmatul iman, if we translate into Arabic. To him, being successful or not successful is not his job. It is God's duty. It's God's plan. And I think I will go to the final point of my final points of my paper. And this is the final part of Nursi's letter, actually. Nursi describes how he came to this methodology, why he preferred this methodology. He gives two examples. The first concerns the Prophet of Islam's actions during the Battle of Badr. He said, I learned from the Prophet, the spiritual jihad, the importance of this. Where in the midst of the greatest physical struggle of the Islamic community, a battle that was a matter of to be or not to be for Muslims, many of you are aware of this battle. Muslims were very few, about 300. The Meccan pagan army was about 1,000. And it was almost to bring in an end to the new religion. Now, under these circumstances, the Prophet did not abandon the sunnah of praying in group, Salatul Jama'ah, the sunnah of praying in group. For Nursi, this shows that if prayer in group, which is an important element of humanity's spiritual well-being, is more important than the most important instance of physical or this worldly well-being for Muslims, then in the ordinary circumstances of daily life, there can be no this worldly circumstance that trumps the needs of the spiritual life or the afterlife. So basically, a small thing of the spiritual life is greater than the greatest physical things that we might face. Therefore, a small truth of faith, which is related to the afterlife and gaining eternal happiness, is more preferable to Nursi than the greatest possessions of this worldly life. This is the first one. And Nursi says, therefore, if the Prophet was not abandoning Sunnah in this great struggle in the early Islam, then Muslims have to give more attention to these principles of faith rather than physical struggles. The second one, he says, Nursi refers to the prayer of Imam Ali to God for two protectors while he was performing his prayers, so that he could give his entire concentration to his prayers. When you have prayer, you have to have concentration. And that's why concentration is related to the spiritual well-being. This, for Nursi, again shows the importance of spiritual well-being as opposed to even the most important aspects of this worldly life, and that is life itself. So in conclusion, for the future of humanity, spiritual jihad is the methodology that will lead to peace, and peace will lead to happiness for all human beings. Let me finish with a quote from Pope Francis, who in his Christmas message of 2013 said, God is peace. Let's ask him to help us to be peacemakers each day. And in our life, in our families, in our cities and nations, in the whole world, let us allow ourselves to be moved by God's goodness. And I think that is what Nursi would call spiritual jihad. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to all three of our panelists. Given that we're running a little behind, I'll limit this question and period to very short amount of time. So I think we have time for 2 questions. Oh, yes.
So, as you can imagine, there is a lot of opposition to his, I guess, his views. Among the ulama, there are a number of people who have individually conceded to him that what he's saying is true, but there are no public declarations of it. The problem is that in some issues he goes really over what is considered to be a normative line. So take the issue of Jerusalem. He has written publicly in many places that Jerusalem should be just given to Jews, what he calls, or Israelis or whatever, because even in the Quran it's acknowledged that it belongs to them. I'm just giving you a very crude summary of his book on that topic. And so even though many people in the Muslim communities across India and in other parts of the world are convinced that what he's saying merits some thought and consideration, they're also completely jolted by some of the statements with regard to Jerusalem, with regard to the victim, the victimhood narrative that you hear in India by Indian Muslims. And so he's completely dismissive of that. And I think that holds people back from supporting his ideas on peace and dawah and, solidarity and that type of stuff. That's a short answer.
Oh, please. No?
Thank you. Yes, and I've read Fazlur Rahman's work on this too. He also talks about intellectual jihad as something underlying his own work. Thank you.
I'm sure that there are other questions, but I'm also sure that lunch is ready. So please join me again in thanking our panelists.